For 72 hours, no doctor, nurse, security officer, or animal handler could move the German Shepherd from the ICU doorway. He had not slept more than a few minutes at a time. He had barely eaten. He watched every person who came near room 214 with eyes so steady that even experienced staff lowered their voices when they passed. Then, just after sunrise, a nurse no one expected stepped out of the elevator, looked at the dog, and whispered one word no stranger should have known. Before the story continues, tell us where you are watching from today. Stories of loyalty travel farther than any road, and I would love to know where this one finds you. And if you believe love can keep its promise even through silence, please subscribe and stay with us. When the story ends, share in the comments which moment touched your heart the most. Dawn had barely lifted over Asheville, North Carolina. A thin silver line stretched across the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the windows of St. Gabriel Medical Center caught the first pale light of morning. Outside, the city was still quiet. Inside the intensive care wing, quiet felt different. It was not peaceful. It was cautious. The steady tones of monitors drifted through the hallway. Nurses moved from room to room with fresh charts, medication trays, and cups of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. Their sneakers made soft sounds across polished floors that smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain-damp jackets. But every time they passed room 214, their steps slowed. Everyone had learned to respect the dog at the door. Ranger lay just outside the room, his body angled toward the hallway, his head lifted, his amber eyes open and alert. He was a large German Shepherd with a sable coat, a broad chest, and the kind of silent discipline that made people feel watched without ever being threatened. He did not bark at the staff. He did not snap. He did not lunge. He simply made one thing clear. No one entered that room unless he decided they were allowed. For 3 days and 3 nights, he had remained there. Food had been placed near him, but he only ate enough to stay on his feet. Water was accepted after he looked back at the man in the bed, almost as if he needed permission from someone who could not speak. When nurses tried to coax him away, Ranger lowered his head and stared. When hospital security arrived, he rose slowly and planted himself in front of the door. Animal control offered help and then quietly stepped back after watching the way he guarded the room. Inside the bed lay Ethan Walker, a retired Navy SEAL whose strength had once seemed carved from stone. Now his shoulders looked smaller beneath the white hospital blanket. His dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples. Medical tape rested against his skin, partly covering the edge of a faded tattoo near his neck, the outline of a German Shepherd, worn by time, but clearly loved. Ethan's face remained calm despite the tubes, wires, and monitors surrounding him. Even unconscious, he carried the stillness of a man trained never to panic. The hospital staff knew only pieces of his life. They knew he lived alone in a small cabin outside town, where the forest pressed close to the porch and the nearest neighbor was half a mile down a gravel road. They knew he rarely spoke more than he needed to. They knew the dog had come in the ambulance with him and refused to leave. At one point, early in the first night, someone had suggested moving Ranger to a kennel for safety. Ethan, barely conscious then, had opened his eyes just enough to whisper 2 words. He stays. No one asked again. Since then, Ranger had built an invisible perimeter around the man who had built a life around him. Whenever Ethan's breathing changed, Ranger heard it before the monitor reacted. Whenever footsteps approached, his ears lifted. Whenever a stranger paused near the doorway, the dog watched with such focused judgment that even doctors found themselves explaining what they were about to do. Some of the staff called it training. Some called it instinct. One elderly janitor, a quiet man named Mr. Alvarez who had worked in the hospital for almost 30 years, stopped one morning with his mop handle resting in his hands and shook his head. "No," he whispered. "That's love standing guard." Outside the ICU windows, birds began calling from the oak trees along the parking lot. Warm light moved slowly over the brick building and touched the glass. It softened the waiting room, the nurse's station, the vending machines humming at the end of the hall. But near room 214, the air remained tense, as though night had not fully ended there. Then the elevator doors opened with a quiet chime. A nurse stepped out carrying a clipboard and a small paper cup of coffee. She was in her early 30s, with tired eyes, a neat ponytail, and the calm posture of someone who had learned to keep fear from entering her hands. Her name badge read Emily Carter. She paused the moment Ranger looked at her. The nurses at the station noticed immediately. A few of them leaned back from their screens. One whispered, "She should wait." But Emily did not retreat. She set her coffee on the counter, held the clipboard against her side, and took one slow breath. Then she began walking toward the dog. Nobody noticed that she never once looked afraid. Nobody knew that years earlier, long before she had become a nurse, a dying man had entrusted her with a word he said she must never speak unless the moment truly called for it. And nobody understood that in only a few seconds, a promise buried beneath grief, silence, and service was about to wake again. Ethan Walker had not always lived as though the world ended at the edge of his driveway. Years before the cabin, before the unopened mail and the quiet mornings, his life had been measured by briefings before dawn, steady breathing in dark places, and the knowledge that every person beside him might one day need him to be braver than he felt. He had once trusted teams, orders, maps, radios, and the familiar weight of responsibility. He had once laughed more easily. He had once believed coming home meant the danger stayed behind. But home did not always know how to receive people who returned changed. The cabin near Pisgah National Forest gave Ethan what people could not: space, silence, and predictable days. Tall pines surrounded the property. Rain tapped the tin roof in the evenings. Smoke from the wood stove curled through cold mornings. A creek ran behind the shed, its small voice threading through the trees. It was beautiful, but not in a way that asked anything of him. That was why he stayed. Neighbors knew almost nothing about him. The mail carrier knew he sometimes left letters in the box for a week. The cashier at the hardware store knew he paid in exact cash and always stood where he could see the entrance. The grocery clerk knew he bought the same simple items every Tuesday morning: coffee, eggs, bread, canned soup, dog food, and apples he rarely ate. Children in town admired Ranger, but Ethan kept a polite distance, nodding once before continuing on. He was not rude. He was tired. Ranger understood that kind of tiredness better than anyone. Every morning at 6, the German Shepherd stepped onto the porch first. He would scan the tree line, listen to the birds, turn his face into the wind, and then look back at Ethan. Only then did Ethan come outside with black coffee in a chipped ceramic mug. They sat together on 2 old porch boards that creaked in the same places every day. Ranger rested beside the chair while mist lifted from the hills. Neither of them needed words. At night, Ranger slept beside the fireplace until Ethan put down whatever book he had been pretending to read. During thunderstorms, the dog placed his head over Ethan's boots as thunder rolled through the valley. If Ethan woke before dawn with his breath caught in his chest, Ranger appeared at the bedside before the nightmare had finished leaving the room. The dog never demanded explanations. He simply stayed. That was what saved Ethan more times than he could count. Months earlier, his family doctor had gently suggested counseling. Ethan had thanked him and changed the subject. Former teammates invited him to reunions. He mailed polite replies and stayed home. Holiday cards were stacked unopened in a cedar box under the bed, along with photographs he could not look at for long. Ranger seemed to know the box carried pain. Whenever Ethan stood over it too long, the dog nudged his hand until he stepped away. It was not dramatic. It was loyalty in its quietest form. 3 mornings before the hospital, Ethan had been stacking firewood behind the cabin. Autumn leaves moved through the air. Around him, golden brown and red. Ranger carried small split logs in his mouth, proud of a job no one had ever taught him. Ethan had smiled at that, just barely, before a hard pressure tightened beneath his ribs. He placed one hand against his chest. "Not today," he whispered. His knees weakened before he reached the porch. Ranger dropped the log and rushed to him. The dog pressed his body against Ethan, slowing his fall, then barked once. It was not frantic. It was deep, sharp, and commanding. A utility worker repairing a line down the road heard the sound echo through the trees and ran toward the cabin. By the time the ambulance arrived, Ranger was lying beside Ethan with his head pressed against his shoulder. The paramedics tried to make room. Ranger made it clear he was already exactly where he needed to be. When they loaded Ethan into the ambulance, the German Shepherd climbed in behind him. One paramedic started to protest, then looked at the unconscious man, looked at the dog, and closed the door. From that moment on, Ranger had only one mission: stay with him until dawn. The hallway outside room 214 remained still as Emily approached. Her steps were slow, not timid. Ranger watched every movement. His ears pointed forward. His eyes did not narrow, but they did not soften either. The nurses behind the station exchanged uneasy looks. They had seen specialists and security officers stop at nearly the same place. Ranger had a way of making people feel they had reached a line drawn on the floor only he could see. Emily stopped where the morning sunlight fell across the tile. She did not crouch too quickly. She did not reach toward him. She folded her hands loosely in front of her and waited. Ranger lifted his head a little higher. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Emily noticed details others had overlooked because they were too focused on getting past him. Ranger was not acting like a frightened animal. His front paws were aligned with almost military precision. His body blocked the doorway, but not in chaos. It created a protective angle between the hall and Ethan's bed. His breathing changed whenever he glanced into the room. He was tired, but not confused. He was working. Emily lowered herself slowly onto one knee. Ranger's nose twitched once. The scent of hospital soap clung to her hands. Beneath it was faint lavender lotion, the same brand she had used since nursing school because it reminded her of her mother's garden. Ranger studied her without moving. A younger nurse whispered, "She's getting too close." Another nurse answered, "If that dog wanted to stop her, he already would have." Emily kept her voice soft. "You've been holding the line a long time, haven't you?" Ranger blinked once. It was the first response anyone had seen that did not feel like refusal. Emily glanced past him into the room. Ethan lay still beneath the blanket. Green lines moved across the cardiac monitor. Clear tubing caught the light near his arm. The faded German Shepherd tattoo at his neck made her chest tighten with a feeling she could not yet name. The charge nurse, Linda Hayes, stepped closer but kept a respectful distance. "We tried handlers from the sheriff's office," she whispered. "We tried food. We tried commands. Nothing works. He only watches." Emily did not take her eyes off Ranger. "Sometimes the answer is not another command." Linda frowned gently. "Then what is it?" "Sometimes trust remembers a voice before it remembers a face." The words settled over the hallway. Ranger tilted his head almost imperceptibly. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. The dog was not recognizing her, not exactly. But something in him recognized something she carried. Her gaze drifted toward the bedside table inside the room. A clear plastic bag held Ethan's belongings. Beside it rested an old stainless steel dog tag, its edges worn smooth by years of touch. A ray of sunlight struck the metal and flashed briefly across Ranger's eyes. The German Shepherd inhaled deeply. Then he looked back at Emily. A memory rose from the deepest place in her mind. Her father, Thomas Carter, had trained military working dogs for many years before illness made his hands tremble. He had never talked much about missions. He talked about bonds, about patience, about trust that had to be earned without shortcuts. When Emily was a child, she would sit on the porch wrapped in an old quilt while he cleaned leather collars and polished brass nameplates that belonged to dogs who had long since retired. "The finest working dogs," he used to say, "don't remember every face. They remember every promise." Emily had loved those stories without fully understanding them. Now, kneeling in a hospital hallway before a dog who had refused to surrender his post, she began to understand. Ranger had a faint scar above his left eye, nearly hidden beneath thick sable fur. Emily stared at it for a moment, and another memory surfaced. Her father had once shown her a photograph of a young German Shepherd with a mark in the same place. She could not remember the dog's name. She remembered only the tenderness in her father's voice. "Some partners save lives because they are strong," he had said. "Others save lives because they refuse to leave." Emily lowered her gaze, not in submission, but respect. When she looked back at Ranger, she felt the past opening like a door. She had been 17 the day her father told her about the word. Rain had fallen all afternoon. She sat in his workshop while he prepared equipment for a visiting military team. The room smelled of leather, oil, sawdust, and wet earth. Before the men arrived, her father placed a folded American flag inside a cabinet and turned to her with unusual seriousness. "There is a word," he said. "It belongs to certain teams who carried a promise together. It is not dangerous. It is sacred. Never speak it casually. Never use it to impress anyone. But if grace ever puts you in front of one of them, and you know they need to remember who they are, you will know." He told her the word once. Years passed. Her father retired. Then came the diagnosis, the hospital bed, the quiet shrinking of a man who had once seemed larger than every room. One evening near the end, he took Emily's hand and whispered the same word again. "Someday," he said, "if one of them still carries the watch, speak it gently. Do not command. Remind." Emily had never repeated it. Not to friends. Not in nursing school. Not after joining St. Gabriel. At times, she wondered if it had been no more than an old man's. Grief folded into memory. But Ranger was watching her now, as if he had waited years for someone to bring that memory home. Linda whispered, "Emily? Are you all right?" Emily answered without turning around. "I think we've all been speaking the wrong language." Ranger's ears lifted another fraction. Emily rose slowly to her feet. She stepped no closer. She looked once toward Ethan asleep inside the room, then back to the German shepherd guarding him with everything he had left. The hallway became so still that even the elevator bell at the far end seemed distant. Emily took one slow breath. Her father had told her never to speak the word loudly. The important words, he said, were entrusted, not announced. So Emily spoke almost like a prayer. "Overwatch." The word moved through the hallway so softly that it nearly disappeared beneath the beeping monitor inside Ethan's room. But Ranger heard it. Before the final sound faded, his ears shot forward. His eyes widened. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, the German shepherd looked away from Ethan's doorway and stared directly into Emily's face, as if an entire forgotten world had opened in front of him. Nobody moved. A doctor walking past stopped mid-step. Linda held one hand against her chest. The receptionist at the far desk leaned over the counter, sensing that something important had happened without knowing what. Ranger stood. He took one slow step toward Emily, then another. There was no aggression in him now, no warning, no suspicion. He moved with careful recognition, lifting his nose slightly, as if searching for a scent attached to the sound. Emily remained still. Her hands stayed open at her sides. Ranger stopped less than 3 feet away. His tail gave one slow sweep across the floor. It was not excited. It was not playful. It was enough to make Linda whisper, "That's the first time he's moved away from the door." Emily's eyes filled, but she kept her voice steady. "He isn't responding to me. He's responding to a promise." Ranger lowered his head. The tension along his shoulders began to loosen, muscle by muscle, as if a weight he had been carrying for years had shifted slightly from his back. Relief moved through him so quietly that only those watching closely could see it. Inside the room, Ethan remained unconscious. Morning light reached his bed now, touching the tattoo at his neck. The inked outline of the German shepherd seemed softer under the glow. Ranger turned toward Ethan. Then he looked back at Emily and calmly stepped aside from the doorway. It was one pace. Just one. But to the nurses who had been unable to enter without fear for 3 days, it felt like a locked gate opening. Dr. Michael Bennett, Ethan's attending physician, stood near the door with his chart in hand. He looked at Emily, then at Ranger. "May we come in?" Emily did not answer for the dog. She simply looked toward Ranger. The German shepherd sat beside the wall, still watching Ethan, but no longer blocking the entrance. Linda covered her mouth. "I've never seen anything like this." Emily smiled gently, without triumph. "Neither have I." Then she stepped into room 214 slowly, respectfully, as though entering a space that belonged to 2 old soldiers and a promise no hospital policy could ever fully understand. The room felt different once Emily crossed the threshold. The heaviness that had filled it for 3 days had not vanished, but it had softened. Sunlight rested across the blanket, the bed rail, the 4-pole, and the worn dog tag beside Ethan's personal belongings. Near the tag lay a folded wedding band, scuffed but carefully kept, the kind of ring a man carries when he no longer knows how to wear it. Emily adjusted Ethan's blanket and checked his foreline. She moved slowly, aware that Ranger watched every motion. The dog sat against the wall, but his eyes followed her hands with careful attention. He was not threatening her now. He was deciding whether she belonged inside the circle he had protected for so long. Emily gently brushed a loose strand of gray hair away from Ethan's face. "You have someone waiting for you," she whispered. "He hasn't stopped believing you would come back." The words were meant for Ethan, but Ranger lowered his head onto his paws and released a deep breath. It sounded less like exhaustion than permission. Linda closed the door halfway to quiet. The hallway noise. Outside, nurses changed shifts and phones rang softly at the desk. Inside, time moved differently. Emily glanced at the belongings on the table. Along with the dog tag and ring, there was a weathered leather wallet, a faded photograph of Ethan beside a much younger ranger under tall pine trees, and a folded piece of paper that had been opened so many times its creases had turned white. She did not touch the paper. She did not need to. Some histories announced themselves without being read. Lives were rarely held together by grand victories. More often, they were held together by small objects a person could not let go. Ranger stood and walked toward the foot of the bed. Everyone in the doorway tensed for half a second, wondering if he would reclaim his position. Instead, he lowered himself onto the floor where he could see both Ethan and Emily. Dr. Bennett smiled. He just expanded his circle of trust. Emily nodded. Not because I earned it today, because someone remembered it for him. Dr. Bennett reviewed Ethan's chart, checked the monitor, and watched the man's breathing for several seconds. His condition is still serious, he said quietly, but he is stable. If he continues like this, there is reason to hope. Hope did not arrive with fireworks. It entered the room carefully, like a visitor afraid to disturb the sick. Emily sat beside the bed after the team left. Ranger rested near her chair, one eye always on Ethan. Outside the window, the Blue Ridge Mountains brightened under the rising sun. Oak branches moved gently in the morning breeze, scattering shifting shadows across the glass. Emily remembered something else her father had said after a difficult training day. The strongest bond is never built through fear. It is built by showing up every morning, even when no one notices. That was exactly what Ranger had done. Every sunrise at the cabin, every storm, every nightmare, every mile to the hospital. And for the first time since Ethan had collapsed, the faithful dog allowed his eyes to close for more than a heartbeat. Just a moment of rest. But sometimes a moment is where healing begins. By late afternoon, the ICU had returned to its normal rhythm, but room 214 remained changed. Nurses who had once hurried past the doorway now paused with soft smiles when they saw a ranger sleeping beside Ethan's bed. The German shepherd still lifted his head when someone entered, but the sharpness in his posture had faded. He looked less like a wall and more like a guardian who had accepted help. Emily finished updating Ethan's chart, then pulled a chair near the window. Crimson leaves drifted through the courtyard below. Visitors moved slowly along the garden path, some carrying flowers, some holding hands, some walking alone with expressions that said they were trying not to fall apart in public. Hospitals taught Emily that ordinary life kept happening right beside heartbreak. Someone laughed in the cafeteria while another family cried in a waiting room. A baby was born 2 floors above while an old man said goodbye 1 wing over. The world did not stop for pain, but sometimes it made room for mercy. Dr. Bennett entered with the latest test results. He studied the monitors and smiled faintly. His numbers are moving in the right direction, slowly but steadily. Sometimes steady is the greatest miracle, Emily said. The doctor glanced at Ranger. I still can't explain what happened this morning. Emily followed his gaze. Maybe not everything important needs to be explained before it's respected. After Dr. Bennett left, the room settled again. Emily noticed the old dog tag on the table. Behind it hung a smaller tag she had not seen clearly before. Its surface was worn nearly smooth, but 3 words remained engraved across the metal. Stand until dawn. A quiet chill passed through her. Her father had spoken that phrase many times. Not like a slogan, like a vow. Ranger lifted his head as though he sensed her attention. Emily looked at him and whispered, "You kept the promise, didn't you?" The German shepherd stood, walked to the bedside table, and lowered his nose close to the tags without touching them. He stayed there for several long seconds, breathing softly, almost reverently. Emily understood then that the promise had not ended when Ranger and Ethan left the military. For some bonds, there was no retirement ceremony strong enough to erase responsibility. Ranger had carried the watch into the cabin, into the ambulance, into the hospital, and into every sleepless hour outside room 214. She remembered being a little girl, asking her father why military working dogs always seemed so serious. He had smiled, tired from a long training day, and answered, because someone trusted them with another human heart. Dogs don't forget that kind of responsibility. Now she finally understood the weight of that sentence. Ranger was not guarding Ethan because he had been trained to guard. He was guarding him because duty had become love. That difference mattered. The room remained quiet until a faint sound rose from the bed. It was almost nothing, just a slow exhale with a different rhythm. Emily turned immediately. Ethan's breathing had changed. The monitor stayed steady, but one finger moved slightly against the blanket. Ranger noticed before anyone else. His ears lifted. He stepped closer to the bed, amber eyes fixed on Ethan's hand. Emily leaned forward. Ethan, nothing. Then another movement came, barely visible. It would have been easy to dismiss as a reflex. Ranger did not dismiss it. He stood perfectly still, watching with patient certainty, as if he had waited through too many dark mornings to doubt the first sign of light. Emily called for Dr. Bennett. When he arrived, he performed a careful assessment. The responses were small, but they were there. He looked at Emily with quiet hope. His brain is beginning to respond more consistently, he said. I can't promise when he will wake, but I believe he hears more than we realize. Emily looked at Ranger. Someone else believed that from the beginning. Evening settled over Asheville. The last sunlight slipped behind the mountains, leaving the sky lavender and blue. Rain began after dark, tapping gently against the windows. The scent of wet pavement drifted in from the lobby whenever the automatic doors opened below. Emily stayed after her shift ended. No one asked her to. She simply could not bring herself to leave. Around midnight, while adjusting Ethan's blanket, she noticed his breathing deepen. It was no longer strained in quite the same way. Dr. Bennett returned and listened, then nodded. His body is resting instead of fighting, he said. That matters. Tomorrow may look different. Ranger walked to the side of the bed until his nose hovered near Ethan's hand. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then Ethan's fingers curled faintly toward Ranger's fur. It was weak. It lasted only a heartbeat. But it was real. Ranger's tail brushed the floor once in a slow sweep. Emily pressed the call button with tears in her eyes. Dr. Bennett came back quickly and confirmed what they had seen. He looked down at Ethan's hand, then at the dog who had waited for that small movement, as if it were the most important message in the world. He's reaching back, the doctor whispered. No one cheered. No one disturbed the moment. They stood in grateful silence while rain washed the windows in silver lines. Somewhere beyond the clouds, dawn was already traveling toward the mountains. Morning came softly after the rain. Sunlight slipped through the blinds in thin gold lines, crossing the floor of room 214 and touching Ranger's paws. The air smelled of clean linen, fresh coffee from the nurse's station, and the faint pine scent that drifted in from the courtyard doors downstairs. Emily arrived before her shift officially began. She told herself she wanted to check the chart early, but the truth was simpler. She needed to be there. Ranger was awake beside Ethan's bed. His posture remained calm, but his eyes carried expectation now instead of restless vigilance. He looked at Ethan's face as though listening for a voice that had almost reached the surface during the night. Dr. Bennett entered with the morning chart and smiled as soon as he saw the monitor. His responses improved again. His body is doing more on its own. Emily moved beside the bed and gently adjusted the blanket near Ethan's shoulder. Good morning, Ethan, she said. It's a beautiful day outside. Ranger has been waiting to hear your voice. The room held still. Then Ethan's eyelids trembled. Ranger stood without making a sound. His ears lifted. Another slow movement followed. Ethan's brow tightened as if he were trying to find his way through heavy fog. Dr. Bennett checked the monitor and nodded. Talk to him. Familiar voices can help. Emily swallowed. You are safe. Ranger never left you. Not for 1 minute. The German shepherd stepped closer until his nose rested beside Ethan's hand. Morning light warmed the faded tattoo on Ethan's neck and glinted off the dog tags on the table. For a moment, nothing else happened. Then Ethan's fingers curled into Ranger's thick fur with unmistakable intention. It was weak, but it was no accident. Emily covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Ranger did not bark. He did not jump. He closed his eyes and leaned gently into the touch he had waited days to feel again. Dr. Bennett smiled with quiet relief. Welcome back, he said. Ethan's eyelids fluttered once more. Slowly, painfully, they opened just enough for the pale morning light to enter tired blue eyes. At first he seemed to see only shapes. The ceiling, the four-pole, the blur of Emily's face. Then his gaze moved downward and found the amber eyes waiting beside the bed. Ranger's tail moved once. Ethan tried to speak. Only air came at first. His hand tightened slightly against Ranger's neck. Emily leaned closer. Take your time. Ethan swallowed. His eyes moved from Emily back to Ranger. Confusion faded. Recognition arrived. Peace followed, slow and fragile, but unmistakable. After several breaths, he whispered two simple words. Good boy. Ranger rested his head carefully against the edge of the mattress and released a long breath that sounded like the end of a burden. Emily looked at the old tag on the table and thought of her father, of the word he had carried, of the promise he had trusted her to speak when the time came. She understood then that the promise did not belong only to one handler, one dog, or one mission. It belonged to faithfulness itself. Some promises are spoken once and forgotten by the world. Others are carried through years of silence until the right sunrise finally brings them home. Ethan spent most of that day drifting in and out of sleep. His voice remained weak, but his awareness returned in pieces. By afternoon, he could answer short questions. By evening, he could keep his eyes open long enough to watch Ranger sleeping beside him. Emily entered with a fresh pitcher of water and found Ethan studying the old dog tag on the bedside table. His hand trembled as he reached for it. She moved to help, but he shook his head slightly, determined to lift it himself. The worn metal caught the light. For several moments, Ethan said nothing. Then he looked at Emily. You said that word, he whispered. She nodded. I did. His thumb moved over the tag's edge. Nobody has spoken it in years. Emily pulled the chair beside the bed and sat down. She did not rush him. In hospitals, she had learned that memories were like injured people. They arrived when they were able, not when someone demanded them. Ethan looked down at Ranger, who watched him with calm devotion. People think it was a command, Ethan said. It never was. Emily listened. Outside the window, sunlight shimmered across wet branches in the courtyard. Robins hopped along the fence below. The peaceful view seemed almost too gentle for the story Ethan was trying to tell. Years ago, he continued, our instructor told us there might come a day when fear became louder than training. When that happened, we needed something stronger than orders. We needed a word that reminded handler and dog why they were standing together in the first place. He paused to gather strength. Overwatch meant someone else was depending on us to remain faithful. It meant we didn't abandon the line just because we were scared. It meant if one of us fell, the other stood watch until help came. Not because the manual said so, because no one gets left alone. Emily felt her throat tighten. Her father's lessons fit into Ethan's story like missing pieces finally returning to a broken frame. Ethan lifted the smaller tag and gave a tired smile. Stand until dawn. Our instructor gave these to us when we completed training. He said dawn was proof that every night has an ending, even the ones that feel endless. Emily closed her eyes briefly. She remembered her father polishing old collars. She remembered his reverence for dogs who had carried human lives with more honor than many people. She remembered the day he placed the word in her hands like something sacred. Ethan looked at her with quiet curiosity. How did you know it? My father trained working dogs for military teams, she said. Before he passed away, he told me that if I ever met someone still carrying that promise, I would know when it was time to speak. Ethan's eyes filled with recognition and gratitude. Then your father kept his promise too, he said. No one spoke after that for a while. Ranger rose, walked to Ethan's side, and rested his head gently on the mattress. Ethan laid his hand across the dog's neck with a little more strength than before. The room grew quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt complete, as if two promises carried through different lives had finally met beneath one hospital sunrise. Recovery did not hurry, but it moved. The nurses measured progress in small victories. Ethan sat up a little longer. Then he stood with help. Then he took 3 steps, then 6, then the length of the room. Each accomplishment was quiet, but everyone in room 214 understood that quiet did not mean small. Ranger remained his anchor. Whenever Ethan's breath caught, the German shepherd was there. Whenever a new therapist entered and Ethan's shoulders tightened, Ranger looked up first, then back at Ethan, reminding him without words that the room was safe. The staff eventually placed a folded blanket in the corner for Ranger, but he only used it when Ethan told him to. The rehabilitation hallway overlooked a garden where flowering dogwood swayed in the North Carolina breeze. Patients walked slow laps with nurses beside them. Visitors carried coffee cups and tired hope. Songbirds settled in the branches after rain. Ethan had nearly forgotten how ordinary beauty felt when a person stood still long enough to receive it. One afternoon, after completing a careful walk down the hallway, Ethan paused beside a large window. Ranger stood at his side, his shoulder lightly touching Ethan's leg. Below, a young father showed his little daughter how to toss breadcrumbs to sparrows. The girl laughed when the birds fluttered close to her shoes. Ethan smiled before he realized he was doing it. I haven't stood still and watched people in years, he admitted. Emily, who had joined the session during her break, looked toward the courtyard. Sometimes healing begins when we remember life is still happening beyond our pain. Ethan nodded slowly. He spent years making sure I never felt alone. He looked down at Ranger. Maybe I forgot the rest of the world wasn't always trying to leave me behind. Trust doesn't always return all at once, Emily said. Sometimes it comes back one person at a time. Later that day, a young therapy assistant entered with exercise bands. She froze when she saw Ranger. Before anyone could reassure her, Ethan looked down at the dog and spoke calmly. Stand down, partner. We're safe. Ranger immediately relaxed. He stepped away from Ethan's side and settled onto his blanket. The assistant smiled with visible relief and walked in. Ethan noticed the surprise on everyone's faces. For years, without meaning to, he had asked Ranger to guard every doorway, every stranger, every uncertain moment. Now, for the first time, he was asking his oldest friend to rest, and Ranger trusted him enough to do it. Dr. Bennett saw the moment from the hall and smiled before continuing on his rounds. Emily looked at Ethan with quiet understanding. Neither of them needed to explain what had happened. Some victories could not be measured by blood pressure, scans, or strength tests. They were measured by burdens laid down. Ethan returned to the window, sunlight warming the tattoo at his neck. He rested a hand on Ranger's broad shoulder and whispered, "You kept your promise longer than anyone should have had to." Ranger looked up with peaceful amber eyes. For the first time in years, both of them were learning that loyalty did not always mean standing guard. Sometimes the bravest act was believing the watch could finally be shared. 3 mornings later, St. Gabriel's front doors opened just after sunrise. Cool mountain air drifted inside, carrying the scent of damp earth, pine, and fresh rain. Ethan stood near the entrance wearing a flannel shirt beneath a light jacket. His movements were careful, but he was stronger than he had been when the hospital first received him. Ranger stood beside him without pulling at the leash. He was close because he wanted to be, not because fear required it. Nurses gathered near the desk, pretending to work while watching the discharge. Linda wiped her eyes twice and blamed allergies. Mr. Alvarez leaned on his mop at the end of the hall and nodded with the solemn pride of someone watching a soldier go home. Emily met Ethan near the lobby carrying a small paper bag. Inside were the polished dog tag and the smaller engraved token, cleaned but not changed. She placed them gently into his hand. Ethan fastened them back onto the familiar chain. The soft clink of metal echoed through the lobby like the final note of an old song returning to where it belonged. They belong together, Emily said. Ethan nodded. Just like promises. Ranger leaned his head against Ethan's side, and several nurses laughed softly. Dr. Bennett handed over the final discharge papers, reviewed instructions, and then extended his hand. You did the difficult part, he said. Ethan shook his hand and looked down at Ranger. No, he did. The doctor smiled. Sometimes recovery starts long before medicine catches up. Outside, the Blue Ridge Mountains stretched under a brilliant autumn sky washed clean by rain. Sunlight shimmered on the hospital gardens. An elderly couple shared coffee beneath an oak tree. A volunteer planted chrysanthemums along the walkway. A little boy tossed a tennis ball for a Labrador near the lawn. Ethan paused before crossing the parking lot. For the first time in years, he did not scan every face for danger. He simply noticed them. People living, people laughing, people carrying burdens of their own and still stepping into the morning. Life had continued all along. He had just been standing too far away to see it. Emily walked beside him to the truck. What will you do now? Ethan looked toward the mountains. Go home. Then he added, but I don't think I'm going to hide there anymore. Emily smiled. Ethan looked at her with gratitude that needed no decoration. Your father would have been proud of you. She glanced toward the brightening sky. I hope he knows. I think he does, Ethan said. Ranger climbed into the passenger seat of the old pickup exactly as he had done countless times before. But this morning was different. He did not sit upright to watch every movement through the windshield. After Ethan settled behind the wheel, Ranger turned in a slow circle, lowered himself onto the worn leather seat, and rested his head down. Ethan saw it and smiled softly. "You can rest now, partner," he whispered. "We're going home." Ranger closed his eyes. It was the deepest sleep Emily had ever seen from him. She stood beneath the morning sun as the old pickup rolled toward the road that curved back into the mountains. She watched until it disappeared beyond the trees, carrying two faithful souls whose longest night had finally given way to dawn. Some miracles arrive with crowds, cameras, and headlines. Others leave quietly in an old truck with a weathered dog tag, an open window, and a German shepherd finally believing his watch is over. For several minutes after the truck disappeared, Emily remained in the parking lot with her arms folded against the cool morning air. The world around her returned to normal almost immediately. A delivery van backed toward the service entrance. A family hurried through the sliding doors with a bouquet of grocery store flowers. Somewhere above, a helicopter moved faintly across the sky, its sound softened by distance. Yet Emily felt as though she had just watched something sacred leave the hospital grounds. Linda stepped outside and stood beside her. For once, the charge nurse had no clipboard in her hand, no list of tasks waiting to be completed. She simply looked toward the road where Ethan's truck had vanished. "I was scared of that dog," Linda admitted quietly. Emily smiled without judgment. Most people were. But he wasn't trying to scare us, was he? "No," Emily said. "He was trying to keep the last thing he loved from disappearing." Linda nodded slowly. The words settled between them. Working in a hospital meant seeing many forms of devotion, but most were human and easy to recognize. A husband sleeping in a chair beside his wife. A daughter brushing her mother's hair. A father signing forms with shaking hands because he wanted to be strong for his son. Ranger's devotion had looked different only because it stood on four legs and asked for no language. That afternoon, room 214 was cleaned and prepared for another patient. The bed was stripped. The trash was removed. The monitors were wiped down. Fresh sheets were folded across the mattress with clean hospital precision. To anyone walking in later, it was only another ICU room. But the staff moved through it more gently than usual. One nurse paused near the doorway and looked at the exact place where Ranger had kept watch. Another straightened the bedside table twice, though it was already perfectly arranged. Mr. Alvarez came in last with his mop bucket. He stood at the threshold for a moment, then made the sign of the cross, not in ceremony, but in quiet respect. "Some rooms remember," he said when Emily passed by. She understood what he meant. Over the next few days, the story spread through the hospital in pieces. Not as gossip, but as something people repeated when they needed to remember why tenderness mattered. A young resident who had been impatient with a difficult patient's family spoke more softly after hearing it. A security officer who had once argued that animals did not belong in medical wings admitted that rules sometimes needed room for wisdom. Linda placed a small note on the nurse's station bulletin board that read, "Ask what love is protecting before you try to move it." No one signed it. Everyone knew. Emily called her mother the following Sunday after church. She sat by the window of her apartment with a cup of tea growing cold beside her and told the story from the beginning. Her mother listened without interrupting. When Emily described speaking the word her father had left with her, silence filled the line. At last, her mother exhaled softly. He always hoped that word would find its way back to someone who needed it. Emily wiped her cheek. "I used to think he gave it to me because he was afraid of forgetting." "No, sweetheart," her mother said. "He gave it to you because he trusted you to remember with kindness." That sentence stayed with Emily long after the call ended. She wrote it on a small card and tucked it behind her badge. On hard days, when patients were frightened or families were angry or the hospital felt too full of pain for one heart to carry, she touched the card and reminded herself that memory was not only about the past. Sometimes memory was a tool placed in the hand of the living so they could repair what grief had nearly broken. Ethan's first week back at the cabin was not perfect. Healing rarely was. Some nights, he woke sweating, one hand already reaching for the floor where Ranger slept. Some mornings he stood at the kitchen sink too long, staring out at the woods while old fear moved through him like weather. But something had changed. Before, fear had closed every door. Now, when it came, he opened one. On the third morning home, He called one of the former teammates whose cards had sat unopened in the cedar box. His thumb hovered over the number for nearly 5 minutes before he pressed call. The man answered on the second ring. Walker. Ethan almost hung up. Ranger lifted his head from the rug and looked at him. Ethan swallowed. Yeah, he said. It's me. There was a long pause on the line, and then the old teammate laughed once, not with surprise, but with relief. It's about time, brother. Ethan closed his eyes. For a moment he could not speak. Ranger rose and pressed his shoulder against Ethan's leg. That was enough. They talked for 23 minutes. Not about war. Not at first. They talked about bad knees, grandchildren, broken trucks, and a fishing trip someone still insisted Ethan owed him. When the call ended, Ethan sat on the porch with the phone in his hand and cried openly while Ranger rested beside him. He was embarrassed for only a second. Then he remembered what Emily had said at the window. Life was still happening beyond his pain. Maybe this was how he stepped back into it. Not all at once. One voice at a time. A few days later, Ethan drove into town for groceries and did something he had not done in years. He let a little girl pet Ranger after asking her mother if it was all right. The child approached carefully, solemn with responsibility, and Ranger lowered his head with perfect gentleness. Is he a hero? The girl asked. Ethan looked down at the silver beginning to touch Ranger's muzzle. Yes, he said softly. But mostly, he's my friend. The girl seemed to accept that as the greater title. She patted Ranger once more, then ran back to her mother. Ethan stood in the aisle surrounded by cereal boxes, canned soup, and ordinary conversations, feeling the world return to him in small, almost unbearable pieces. The weeks that followed unfolded gently, but nothing about them felt ordinary to Ethan. Every sunrise over the Blue Ridge Mountains carried new meaning. The cabin no longer felt like a fortress. It was still small, still weathered, still surrounded by trees, but the windows stayed open more often now. Fresh mountain air moved through the rooms, bringing the scent of pine, wildflowers, damp leaves, and wood smoke. The cedar box under the bed was no longer avoided. One evening, Ethan carried it to the porch and opened it while Ranger lay beside his chair. He read the holiday cards from former teammates. He looked at photographs without closing the lid too quickly. He cried once, quietly, not because the grief had vanished, but because he finally believed grief could sit beside him without taking over the whole porch. Ranger watched the tree line each morning, but not with the same restless urgency. He still noticed things. He was still Ranger. But after a few minutes, he stretched in the sunlight and settled at Ethan's feet while coffee steamed between them. Some promises had become memories instead of burdens. A month after leaving the hospital, Ethan drove back to St. Gabriel Medical Center. This time he did not arrive through the emergency entrance. He walked through the front doors with Ranger beside him and a small wooden box under one arm. Emily met them near the lobby. Her smile widened when she saw Ranger. Inside the box was an old leather collar that had belonged to one of the earliest military working dogs Ethan had trained beside. The leather was cracked, but carefully preserved. Beside it was a handwritten note. For every soul who chooses compassion before fear. Thank you for reminding us that healing begins with trust. Emily accepted the gift with tears in her eyes. The collar would later hang inside the staff lounge under a simple plaque that read "Stand until dawn." There was no long explanation beneath it. None was needed. Those who knew the story smiled when they passed. Those who did not know it still paused, sensing that the old collar carried peace. Life continued moving forward. Ethan began volunteering once a week with veterans who were trying to rebuild after difficult seasons. He did not make speeches. He did not pretend to have all the answers. Mostly, he listened. Sometimes he sat with a man who had not slept well in months. Sometimes he shared coffee with a woman who missed the certainty of uniformed life more than she could admit. Sometimes he said only, "You don't have to explain it all today." Ranger helped in ways no one could teach. He approached people slowly, with calm eyes and no demand. He rested beside the ones who needed silence more than advice. More than once, a veteran who had refused to speak placed a hand on Ranger's head and finally let the first sentence come. Ethan discovered something beautiful in those afternoons. Trust returned much the same way it had been lost, one moment at a time. One kind word, one shared silence, one faithful presence that did not walk away. Emily continued her work at the hospital, but sunrise changed for her too. Whenever she passed the east-facing windows before a shift, she paused to watch the first light touch the mountains. She thought of her father, of his worn hands, of the sacred word he had carried until he could pass it to her. She realized he had not truly disappeared. His kindness lived whenever she chose compassion over fear. His lessons lived whenever she treated a guarded heart as something wounded rather than dangerous. As for Ranger, age gradually silvered his muzzle. His amber eyes stayed warm. He no longer stood watch because fear demanded it. He rested because love finally allowed it. On quiet evenings, Ethan sat on the porch while the stars appeared above the trees. Ranger slept beside his chair, paws twitching in gentle dreams. Sometimes Ethan looked down at him and whispered, "You kept me alive longer than you ever knew." Ranger would open one eye, sweep his tail once against the boards, and drift back to sleep. Looking back, maybe the miracle was not that one word spoken at dawn changed everything. Maybe the miracle was that loyalty survived long enough for someone to remember it. We often imagine courage as something loud, a heroic charge, a final stand, a moment everyone can see. But sometimes courage is quieter than that. Sometimes courage is a dog lying outside a hospital room for 3 days because love will not let him move. Sometimes it is a nurse speaking a word her father trusted her to carry. Sometimes it is a wounded man deciding that going home does not have to mean hiding from the world. Some stories do not end with applause. They end with grace. They end with a porch overlooking quiet mountains, an old truck beneath tall pines, a dog tag catching the morning sun, and a German shepherd sleeping without fear because he knows his best friend is finally home. If this story touched your heart, what stayed with you most? Was it Ranger's faithful watch, Emily's forgotten word, or Ethan's decision to trust life again? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your stories and reflections help us create more meaningful journeys like this. And if you believe kindness, loyalty, and hope can still change lives, please subscribe and join us for the next story. Until then, may you always find someone willing to stand beside you until your own dawn finally arrives.